youth council members for being here. We really appreciate this. And then without further ado, I will turn this over to our moderator to run our panel, Mr. Miles Jackson. All right, and he will be your moderator from now on, and he will lead us to the end of this event. So thank you so very much.
Good afternoon and welcome to our 2021 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Youth-Led Panel Discussion entitled, He Had a Dream, Are We Living It? My name is Miles Jackson and I will be the moderator for this afternoon. I serve on both the Carrboro Youth Advisory Board and the Chapel Hill Carrboro NAACP Youth Council. This event is a collaboration of the Carrboro Youth Advisory Board, the Carrboro Youth Council, and the Chapel Hill Carrboro NAACP Youth Councils. We hope that the program will remind us all of the legacy that Dr. King left us and the importance of the continued work of social justice. I would like to thank and welcome our guest panelists that took their time out of their day to attend this discussion. After I introduce you, please take a few minutes to tell us about yourself. So first, we have Kendall Little, and she's a member of the Youth Advisory Board and the NAACP Youth Council.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kendall Lytle. I'm 16 years old, and I'm the co-vice president of the NAACP Youth Council, Chapel Hill Carrboro. I am also an active member of the Carrboro Youth Advisory Board. I am a junior at Middle College High School at Durham Tech, and I'll just give a description of the reason why I wanted to be on this panel today. I feel like there has been a lot, with the protests that we had last summer of 2020, I feel like there were more youth taking action and more youth trying to spread their voices, and I wanted to be one of those youth today, just to make sure that we get those opinions out and know what our youth want from our community and things like that. So I'm really happy to be here, and I hope we get the solutions we want out of this conversation and we get the outcome we want out of this conversation.
Thank you, Kendall. So next we have Ty Hune. He's a part of the Chapel Hill Town Council, and he's a co-founder of ACTA Solutions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. That's pretty much me in a nutshell. I've been a Chapel Hill resident for 5 years now. Came here for UNC and have loved it so much I decided to stay forever. And I'm super excited to participate on this youth-led panel. And I don't feel super youthful with all of these great young people here. So I'll let them do most of the talking.
Thank you, Ty. So next we have Nia Farrington. She is a political science major at Howard University and a former Carrboro High School class president.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nia Farrington. I'm currently a junior at Howard. As he said, I graduated from Carrboro back in 2018. Just to piggyback off of Kendall, I'm here today because I'm super passionate about youth activism and youth leading the way, but even more passionate about doing things back in my community. So while I may be going to school in DC, I love to be in tune with what's going on back at home. So that's why I'm here today.
Thank you, Nia. So next we have Lieutenant Will Quick, and he's a part of the Carrboro Police Department.
Afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for inviting me and letting me join in this discussion. A little bit about me. I've been in law enforcement for 26 and a half years. Part of that was in Chapel Hill, part of that was in a town called Holly Springs, and now I'm looking to finish out my career here at Carrboro. As the law enforcement representative on this panel, it is especially important for me because a huge gap that we're experiencing right now is with the community at large, as well as specific segments and their relationship with law enforcement. These discussions are important in order for us to try to bridge and figure out where those gaps are and figure out what the disconnect is. And I believe that our profession can be change agents to help build those bridges, and we can stop the bleeding, for lack of better terms.
Thank you, Lieutenant. So next we have Adam Davis, and he's a part of the North Carolina School of Science and Math, and he's a leader of the Republican Party.
Hey everyone, thank you Miles for your introduction. So yeah, I'm a senior this year at the North Carolina School of Science and Math. I'm originally from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I don't know, I've really enjoyed getting this opportunity today, and I really look forward to a productive discussion and hearing everyone's opinion. I think especially in our very disunited world today, I think it's really important that we have an open conversation and come together and really find some similarities with each other.
Thank you, Adam. And lastly, we have Ryan Kalo, and he's also a part of the North Carolina School of Science and Math, and he's a leader of the Socialist Club.
Yeah, hello, my name is Ryan Kalo. Prior to NCSSM, I was born and raised in Alamance County, North Carolina. And if you don't know where that is, it's about halfway between Durham and Greensboro. And the reason why I'm here is when I really got into leftist politics, the topic and thought of intersectionality became very important to me, especially seeing people in my own community, all races, struggling economically. And being here today really means to me trying to find solutions that are within the legacy of Dr. King and also advancing our nation in the best way possible.
So wonderful. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Now let's get this discussion on the road. So this is a question for everyone. So please take turns to respond and unmute your mics to speak. So our first question is, how do you think that we can best honor MLK's legacy?
I guess I can start. So I think the best way we can really honor his legacy is really coming together. I think Dr. King would have really loved to, especially see the youth come together like we are today and really having an open conversation. I think that's a really powerful thing that, 50 years ago, having a meeting like this all together and all different backgrounds and races coming together, it was unheard of 50 years ago. And thanks to the work of Dr. King and continued social justice movements, we're able to have this conversation. And I think this meeting is a great start in honoring his legacy.
I can go next. I think one of the best ways that we can honor his legacy is doing a lot more than what we're doing now. I think people are so content and complacent with just having a conversation, and it's about action. And that's the only way that we're going to truly be able to move forward is putting action behind these conversations that we're having. So while it's good and wonderful that we're all here today and we're able to convene and talk about some things that need to be done, all of these things will be dead in this conversation and won't be able to move forward if we can't unite and move forward and put some type of physical work or physical policy, physical labor behind all of the things that we're saying. So I think that's what his legacy is about, is not just discussing what his dream was about or discussing what he wanted to happen, but making it happen and making it come to light.
If no one else would like to go next, I think one of the best way to honor Dr. King's legacy is by actively participating within politics and refusing to take a notion of standardization or being a moderate to. And his letter to the Birmingham jail, he said, "It's not the white citizen counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who's more devoted to order than justice, who is one of the greatest threats to this progress within our country." And I think it's about time, and one of the best ways to honor his legacy is by not being moderate and actually taking a stance on these issues that matter, then putting that stance into praxis, just like Naya was saying.
Yeah, and I guess just hopping on real quick and echoing what Ryan just said, I think Dr. King's legacy, he was a revolutionary and and I think that piece of his legacy has kind of been watered down a little bit over the years. And he really does encourage, so I think in that vein, one of the things we can do to really honor his legacy is to support youth and allow them to be revolutionary and support them in getting involved. I think they're, in places where decisions are made, there are a lot of barriers for youth to participate. And so, it's our role as people who are in those spaces to make it accessible and intentionally reach out to youth and give them the ability to come in and make their voices heard and do a lot of that, physical policy and, the actual action stuff that Naya was referring to.
I would agree with what everyone has said so far, just getting more youth involved with politics, making sure youth know about who Martin Luther King Jr. is, because there are surprisingly many youth and many people in this country who don't know his story and should. Getting more, like I said, getting more youth involved in politics, because we will run this country soon enough. And just making sure that the younger generations know who he is, so they can, when they get older, they can continue to fulfill his dream like we are trying to do now.
I guess I'm last to go. As a people, we need to develop and put into practice empathy, rather than looking at how far we have come as a measure of our success. Empathetically look at how much further there's still so many that need to go. And the old adage, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. As a people, if we learn to reach back and help somebody else up to our level, everybody won't be wealthy, everybody won't be overflowing with abundance. But at the same time, if we have the ability to help our fellow man, then we shouldn't turn away from the opportunity to do so.
Thank you for all of your comments. So next, I have a question for Ty and Kendall to respond to. How would MLK's dream have changed now? Would he be pleased with his progress or continue to look towards the future, or both?
I feel like MLK's dream, Dr. King's dream, its foundation would stay the same. The fact that he wanted us to come together and have conversations and build a community together and fight the monster that is racism and discrimination. I feel like that foundation would stay the same. So I feel like what he would change is that he would try and make us stay on that foundation of trying to talk to each other and not building that divide, because when we build that divide, there is no conversation. And I would say when it comes to how he would feel about the way the world is going now, he would be pleased that the Black community and the Black Lives Matter movement is still trying to get the rights that we deserve, because we could have stopped a long time ago, but we haven't, and we will not stop. So I feel like he'd be pleased that we are continuing to grow, but he would know that there is still so much more for us to do. So he would just tell us to continue to grow and to not stop fighting.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Kendall said. Definitely think Dr. King would, I think both. Dr. King would be very pleased with the progress we have made since then. And I think he would look forward and say that there's still so much more to be done. I think one of his proudest moments would be how youth-led the Black Lives Matter movement is to this day. I think in a press conference that he actually gave in Raleigh, he said that only the youth have the ability to bring a crucial element to the struggle. And I think during his time organizing, there was always a focus on bringing in the youth and centering them and having them kind of lead the way. And so I think the Black Lives movement has really embodied that. And, that's something he'd be really proud of. And then the other piece of that, I think, is he definitely felt that, I think actually a quote from him was, there's another element that must be present in our struggle that then makes our resistance and nonviolence truly meaningful. That element is reconciliation. And I think in our time and age, after the past 4 years, we've gone in, nationally, the complete opposite direction. So I think we have a lot of work, and he would, I think feel this way. We have a lot of work to go and progress to make in that vein of reconciliation and coming together. And I truly believe that the only way to do that is the youth and having them lead that reconciliation.
So thank you for all y'all's comments. So next we have another question for everyone. What are your gut reactions or preconceived notions about those who disagree with you or you deem to be on the other side?
I'll go first with that one since I was last. My gut reaction is it's an opportunity to learn. Simply because I don't agree or someone doesn't agree with me doesn't mean that they don't have something valid that I had not yet considered. So when I enter into conversations with anyone, or you want to call them debates, whatever you want to call them, I prefer to go in with a mindset of listening to understand rather than listening to respond, because I'm certainly not knowledgeable about everything. So that means there's a possibility for me to learn from anyone. And as long as I maintain that open mind, and that's the way that I present myself in my personal, my professional life, a lot of good can come out of that.
I guess I'll add some. I definitely agree with Lieutenant Quick. And you know, it might be because I'm young and I still got a lot to learn. And I'm not gonna lie, I think my gut reaction sometimes isn't the best. You know, it's hard when people come at you from a place of hate to gut react in a loving way. So, you know, in that same vein, like Lieutenant Quick was saying, you know, I'm really trying to learn, you know, how to not suppress that, but to be true to that, but also come back with an open mind and say, you know, this is an opportunity to learn. My gut might not like it, but, you know, to sit in that discomfort and use that as an opportunity to learn about a different perspective, because we all do have different backgrounds and perspectives that formulate how we view the world. And, you know, if we can take that as an opportunity to learn and really understand that, I think that is a beautiful thing and something that Dr. King definitely embodied.
I'll agree with what everyone has said so far. As Ty said, you know, we're still trying to learn, but just to be transparent and honest, like when I think of my gut and when it comes to debating about life and the ability that people have to stand up for what they believe in, and how, you know, it's hard to argue with somebody when you're debating if someone's life matters. And I think that's a lot of what's been going on this year is, you know, with the death of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, a lot of people debated over whether that was constitutional or whether that was right. And debates like that are sometimes hard to do when you're in opposition, because you're debating over if somebody's life was worth losing. So I think those debates are super hard and can be hard to just listen, especially when you're super passionate about what you're talking about and super passionate about whatever side that you're on. While it's important that we listen and try to learn from each other, I think it's also super important to realize what you're debating over and how that will reflect in who you are and how that reflects in what Dr. King would have wanted when it comes to life. And even beyond that, the education that we're giving each other is everything that we're telling each other. Is it truthful? Is it transparent? Is it reflecting in what we were taught? So even going deeper in that, making sure that we're being truthful in what we're teaching each other and truthful in what we're saying, so that we can come to a true resolution in whatever type of conversation that we're having.
And I carry off of that too. Something that I just think needs to be recognized is the fact that when you are having these discussions, there are inherently wrong things and issues you need to just stand hard on that. While you can come to understand each other and appreciate where you've gone to that point, you can't just say, I accept the fact that you disagree with me. That's someone's life. I'm not going to disagree over the value or sanctity of an individual's life because of a political notion of how much that life valued or mattered. And especially on so many issues and things in this country which now govern us were created by racist systems. The majority of the drug laws which are on the books are from the Nixon era of politics, when he was trying to arrest African Americans. And recognizing those things and structures that are in place that actively antagonize minorities within our country, and then to fix them, if someone's not willing to work to do that, or at the very least recognize that issue, you can see the notion is that you're either at least complicit, at worst, or happy with the system as it is. And regardless of either of those two things, you're allowing racism to happen. And my notion is that if you're willing to do such a thing, then it's very hard to get you to the point where we're willing to not do that. This is someone who used to be very far right politically. I started my political journey as a Republican, eventually be a socialist after doing lots of different reading and thinking. And for me, looking back on that, it's just a matter of trying to understand what gets you to that point where you understand other people as that. what blames, what things, what systems we have. And I wouldn't say angry at the other side or anything like that. I just say I'd hope to understand what got them to that point, so that way we can actually get solutions that are necessary.
Yeah, and another thing I'd like to add is that today people are very pent up with just, I don't know, this disunity in America, and people are more focused on being on their side than listening to what people's real stories are. And people are really forgetting like the true emotion that, you know, is built up in someone's life, and, you know, taking it out of the context, especially with the death of Breonna Taylor. I mean, if you look at the story and you look at the facts, I mean, what happened to her was absolutely unacceptable. But I think a lot of people aren't able to take a step back and just realize what actually happened, because they're so sheltered with, I don't know, what they are taught to believe, and they don't really understand what it boils down to, what's going on.
I would agree with what Naya and Ty said about how the fact that my gut feeling isn't always the most positive. Like, I wrote down what my gut feeling would be. I would say that I feel like the people who oppose my opinions happen to have a tendency of being closed-minded and don't know the full story or know my story. And I feel like that ties up with what everyone has said. So just knowing the other person's story and taking a step back to listen not to respond, but listen to them is just something you have to do, because you never know where that person is coming from when it comes to their story. So yes, my gut feeling may be very negative and maybe just very defensive and opposing, but also you never know that the next person's story. So just keeping that in mind is an important thing.
So thank you for all your input. So now I have a question regarding politics for Naya, Adam, and Ryan. And the question is, how do you feel politics has divided us?
If no one else would like to go first. Anything in the way I think politics has divided us in the United States is especially by arbitrary political labels, especially ones relating to the different parties within our country. Like, we have such an issue with trying to get bipartisan legislation across when the majority of the legislation most of the country already approves as is. If we were to just remove the label of Republican and Democrat, most people tend to agree on the same things pretty consistently. Same goes for Obamacare. When presented with the issue of Obamacare, people who said, no, I don't support Obamacare, agreed with its policies and ideas when presented the topic if it wasn't labeled as Obamacare. And I think the way that speaks to politics divides us is because if we were to just look and investigate the solutions that are necessary to have progress in this country, and were to present them to the average American detached from anything, I think most of them would be okay with it. They'd be happy with going in that direction to better their lives. But because of the fact that we've gone so politically polarized by trying to have party leadership and party alliance, we've made it so people keep getting more and more tied to their party. And in the case on the right, where that especially leads to group and mob mentalities, you can see the consequences of that getting worse, and worse over the past few years. And then you've seen a logical response to that rising up within progressive movements. I think it's mostly by arbitrary labels that politics has divided us.
I don't want to cut you off, Naya, if you're going to say something, but I completely agree with what Ryan has said here. You know, political labels are placed on everyone, and you know, the two-party system is a big driver of that force. But it's insane today the way that politics is dividing us, and that entire friend groups and such are broken apart because of political belief, and some is acceptable and unacceptable for different core belief reasons. But just not being able to talk to someone without even knowing them, it's political prejudice, really, on both sides of the aisle, where you just can't have that open conversation just because you're so closed-minded and you can't even listen to someone's core beliefs or core policy just because of their label.
So I have a little bit of a different take on this. I think that the political divide really comes from just a nationwide lack of understanding on the systemic institutionalized racism that the country was built on. I think the same way that we have divides at school between who sits with each other and who hangs out with who is the same way that politics have divided us between creating a side and which side you're going to be on to be the winner who's on top, but without a foundation of really knowing where these political parties came from, that has created the divide between each other because everybody wants to be on top, but they don't know the history behind what really built these political parties. And even now, I think, as Adam was saying, we have people that can't communicate with each other due to different political beliefs, but I think that really comes from what we see on top. The people that represent these political parties are a lot of times how people find their political identity. So if you're automatically assuming that somebody is choosing a political side and you recognize that political party by who they're led by and who they're organized by, it can be difficult to have a conversation or to be a friend with somebody when the divide is being so divided by somebody so strong and words are being said that kind of aren't debatable when it comes to life, as we were talking about earlier. But I really think the divide comes from a lack of knowledge between everybody, not knowing the history and not knowing why the divide actually exists, and just the nature of both political parties.
Okay, so great discussion so far. Thank you again for sharing your opinions. So our next question is for Kendall. During the protests in 2020, the media oftentimes focused on the rioting and looting rather than the focusing on the reason for the protest. Did the riots and looting affect your views on the movement or the protest? Do you think the civil unrest is justified?
I'd like to agree with what you said about the fact that 2020's media had a tendency to portray violence and looting and try and make it look as if it's Black Lives Matter protesters. And the funny thing about it is at the end of the day, it wasn't the Black Lives Matter protesters. It was opposing people or people against the Black Lives Matter movement coming towards the protests and trying to instigate fights and cause violence. And then at the end of the day, it would be placed on the Black Lives Matter protesters because at the end of the day, it was their movement. But there were people inside with ulterior motives. And then there were also protesters who were there for the wrong reasons. So I would agree with that. The 2020 had a tendency to show the violence and the wrongdoing of many protesters. And I would say that the civil unrest and the violence has, in some ways, is very justified because, as me and my mother would talk about all the time, white America is very, very lucky that the Black people in this country are only asking for equality and respect and not revenge. Because if we were asking for revenge, there'd be so much more for white America to worry about than people looting Targets and breaking down businesses that can be built back up in a few months. So I would say that Black people and people of color in this country have every right to be angry and want to riot and do so many bad things that can be considered violent, but we don't. At the end of the day, to be quite honest, we're being really nice right now. The fact that we're being peaceful and protesting is a very good thing, but we could do so much worse. And at the end of the day, if I'm being quite honest, the violence is not as bad as people rioting and breaking down Capitol buildings and pushing police officers and doing all these bad things that Black Lives Matter people aren't even doing. So at the end of the day, I feel like the civil unrest is justified because Black people are still not getting what they should be getting. And yeah, I think that's all.
Thank you for sharing that. So our next question is for everyone. What are your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement?
All right, I'll begin. The Black Lives Matter movement is the modern day version of the civil rights movement. Of course, spearheaded by Dr. King, so much hard work that was done. Out of that movement came a lot of legislative changes, maybe a few hard changes. what we're discovering now with the Black Lives Matter movement is something that's trying to tap into the consciousness of the people, all the people, to understand that there were horrible atrocities in our history that have never truly been accounted for. No reparations, barely even apologies. And the belief that by changing the laws levels the playing field is akin to having a race that's been ongoing for an extended amount of time, and all of a sudden now we're starting at the start line trying to catch up. A number of things are working against us in that regard with regards to economics, sheer numbers as far as population. A great deal of things are working against us. And in order for there to truly be equality, I'm gonna have to go back to that word empathy. We're going to have to understand that there's still a lot of systemic issues. There's still a lot of people that feel a type of way about the color of someone else's skin and what they deserve and what they don't deserve. With that being the case, the Black Lives Matter movement actually probably has an even greater challenge, because changing a heart is a lot different than changing writing on a piece of paper, because people can see what the guidelines are. And for those that have a hardened heart, they don't see where that guideline is telling them what appropriate behavior is. They see, how am I going to try to find a way around what is the established, written, appropriate behavior? So I say that to say this: we have a heart problem in this country. And as much as we like to believe that it is isolated to a relatively small segment of the overall population, I think this last election has illustrated for us clearly that it is a much greater issue than what we may have preferred. The other concern is this modern day with seeing technology and information at the ready. People are seeing what was once a watered down version of the civil rights movement and what people went through. There are folks that are saying, we're not going to continue with this struggle to fight for equality and do it in the same fashion. We saw what happened to people who tried to do it peacefully. And that's probably the scariest part about this. A lot of people are not inclined to adopt Dr. King's nonviolent approach because they saw what happened there. It got a lot of things changed on paper. But in the meantime, a lot of people got hurt in the process. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people now that are not willing to spill blood or to lose blood without spilling blood themselves. And that is where the real tipping point comes in, which is so important that we learn, particularly as law enforcement. We're in a very unique position to be change agents, because when it comes to laws and everything, folks don't remember the legislators. They don't remember the people who support the laws. They remember the people who enforce them. And as change agents, we have the ability to use discretion, discernment, compassion, and recognize people's situations and causalities for why they may have run afoul of the written law and apply the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, and be able to direct them to resources to get them out of their situation that led them to run afoul of the law to begin with. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is tapping into that conscious to hopefully affect that kind of change within the heart.
I can follow that. And something else I wanted to talk about in regards to nonviolent protests too. Violence is only on one side. Throughout the history of nonviolent protests for civil rights movements, there has been a response by the United States government of violence. The protests are going to be violent. It's just a matter of the instigator. And the fact of the matter is, throughout this country, historically, that has been the government. Part of recognizing that history and rewriting it is because right now, the way we teach the civil rights movement, as Lieutenant Quick pointed out, is a watered down version. There's a reason why we're quicker to talk about Dr. King's legacy than we are to talk about Malcolm X or Huey Newton's legacy. There's a reason why those things are more socially acceptable and tangible to us than it is to admit that police officers beat MLK and his followers on multiple occasions at their protests. That history of violence and being able to actually see how it is reflected in our nowadays protest would help people to understand why things are happening as they do. And sorry if my dog barks in the background, she's a little weird. Just as Kendall pointed out, as understanding our history, by recognizing those past failures by our government, it makes the ones that they're having right now that much more apparent and that much more obvious. And just as Lieutenant Quick said, we can't change this by rewriting a piece of paper, but we can do is adequately teach United States history so people understand the nation that they were born into. One on the back of African American slaves, one that was born on the struggle by white people exploiting those people for hundreds of years. And then when we get to this point where there's just such a socioeconomic divide between the two groups, that when they try to reconcile that, it makes white people angry. And the fact that we can't recognize that and say that out loud, like me, as a white person, I need to be able to recognize I have benefited from hundreds and hundreds of years of systemic racism. If I'm not capable of doing that, then they're not really going to get anywhere. They're not able to get anywhere politically, too. So I think, in short, what the most important thing is, at least to me, is not rewriting it, but teaching our history adequately as both a struggle for African Americans to understand freedom, because the fact of the matter, well, not understand, well, get freedom, because we're a nation that fetishized the concept of having a free where people can do as they please. We constantly police people who we believe were outside of that, of Western values. And we need to recognize that before anything can happen and deal with that history as well.
I think the really special things about the Black Lives Matter movement is about the people that are leading and the attention that they're getting. I think when we talk about the civil rights movement, we often call on leaders like MLK and Malcolm X, the men that were leading this movement. And people often neglect the fact that there were a lot of Black women that were protecting and backing these Black men that were being talked about in the front lines. And I think when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we're finally getting the recognition, we as in Black women, for the 3 Black women that founded Black Lives Matter. And I also think it's super important to remember why Black Lives Matter was founded. So it all started after the murder of Trayvon Martin. And I think for a lot of youth that are involved in Black Lives Matter right now, Trayvon Martin was a pivotal point in our lives. I remember I was in 7th grade, and I can remember seeing everything from when it happened to the trial on the news and all the protests going on worldwide. But I remember nothing happening in Chapel Hill. So I think this is a special place to talk about how we kind of create this utopia that Black Lives Matter is kind of an outside thing. And until this summer, Chapel Hill didn't really recognize Black Lives Matter as a Chapel Hill issue or a political thing that Chapel Hill would do. I think, we would see Black Lives Matter signs maybe in people's yards, but we never, had a protest. But I think because of COVID and everybody being at home and having to witness the murder of George Floyd, people realized that this wasn't a state by state or city by city issue, but whether it was a national issue that everybody needed to deal with. So it's not just that we're seeing Black Lives Matter when they're being killed, but Black Lives Matter when we're talking about politics and education and healthcare and everything else in between. So I think Black Lives Matter is meant to be understood as a lot more than just police brutality, but really trying to help people understand what we say when we mean Black Lives Matter. And I think that's something that can be often overlooked when we bring up Black Lives Matter because of how it started, but it's more than just a slogan, and it's more than what people mean when they chant Black Lives Matter. I think another important thing that Ryan was saying was when it comes to education and how we're taught in schools, we learn about these political leaders that have a quote unquote history of being nonviolent, but when we bring up leaders that have maybe had a violent past, we don't talk about why they were violent, or we don't talk about the forces that caused them to be that way, be it the government or be it law enforcement. And we don't talk about these opposing forces oftentimes in schools that are, teachers or that the leaders that in our education system might deem to be, violent, or, why aren't classes learning about what it means to defund the police? Or why aren't classes learning about Black Lives Matter when these are things that are going on right now in our history? But it's all about what's going to be more consistent or watered down or whitewashed when it comes to what we learn. But I think the most important thing is to remember that Black Lives Matter should remain consistent. And, you know, I was in 7th grade when it started, as I said, and, you know, now I'm 20. So it's kind of like it's getting that momentum that the civil rights had, but it's all about consistency and remaining true to what we say, so that despite who's in office now or who was in office, still chanting Black Lives Matter until it's the policy that reinforces it, but also the enforcers and us holding everybody accountable to stay true to what Black Lives Matter really means.
Movement is and probably will be the most important social movement of my lifetime. Like Naya said, you know, that spark, that tipping point was Trayvon Martin and what happened in Ferguson. And I think the movement spent the years since then putting in the legwork to make sure that it could take that momentum and spread. And as we saw this past summer 2020, that is exactly what has happened. The hard work of those organizers and leaders has paid off, and the momentum has skyrocketed across the country. And as Lieutenant Quick pointed out, really entered the mass consciousness of our country. And I think that one of the differences I see between the civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement is back in the civil rights days, we were largely, frankly, trying to convince white legislators and policymakers to make changes and, you know, change those laws on paper. But with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're finally starting to see leaders get elected that look like us and think like us, and their hearts are like ours. So they're finally able to actually address those systemic issues that for so long have plagued our country, because we have been founded, with systems that are inherently racist. And I think continuing to build that momentum and that pipeline of leaders to, go into the system and change it, I think is kind of one of the crowning achievements of the Black Lives Matter movement.
I would like to agree with what everything Naya said. I was one of the youth who was impacted and affected by Trayvon Martin's death and murder. I would say wholeheartedly that his murder is the reason that I want to be a civil rights attorney. So I can defend people like Trayvon Martin and people who look like me, who feel as though they can't defend themselves. And I like the way that the Black Lives Matter movement and the people who support the movement have expanded the movement and made it more than just about eradicating white supremacy and building local power. They are doing more, having more conversations about things like mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, police brutality, and more things that have to do with the depression of trying to lose the Black voices and trying to build on those Black voices just to make sure that those voices are heard. So I would say that I completely support the Black Lives Matter movement, and I hope that more people will support it as well, because the movement isn't gonna go anywhere anytime soon.
I just wanted to add one more thing. I just wanted to say that, in the beginning, I didn't really know what the Black Lives Matter movement meant, and I still have a lot to learn about the movement personally. But I will say, as the movement has gone a lot more mainstream, especially over the course of the summer and right before, I think it's really important that everyone learn what the movement's really about and do their own research, separate from what's necessarily, blasted on media, because of the inherent bias that media has and the agenda that they have to fill. A lot of the times media is not interested on both sides of the aisle in getting you the facts. They're interested in getting the views. And so I think it's really up to the youth and all other generations, but the youth especially, to really do their own research and learn more about the movement.
And also, if I can make another comment, if it's okay, something that's also pretty important to me is how we understand participating within the Black Lives Matter movement. And just posting on social media about your inherent support for something. It's about trying to put in your time and work, going to a protest. And if you can't go to a protest, if you have financial means, donate to organizations that you have the ability to donate to. And if you can't do anything like that, you can always try to volunteer over the phone, via internet. There are so many outlets in the digital age for how you can participate and have active praxis within the Black Lives Matter movement that just idly saying I support it isn't enough. That's also one of the most essential things about the Black Lives Matter movement, which I've learned, is what it actually means to get involved in communities and what it actually means to try to get grassroots discussions between everybody. And that key and piece of it is what, at least to me, when I first started getting involved, really made me understand all the systemic issues within our country. And also how, just as Kendall was pointing out, it's not just Black lives as it relates to the systemic racism with police officers and within our legal system. It's about an African-American student who goes to a school that's underfunded and doesn't get the right education and thereby goes straight through the school prison pipeline. It's about Black lives in a context of a workplace where Black African-Americans are treated harshly and not equally. It's about every stage in life for African-Americans, at least to me, looking into it, are treated less than they deserve to be. And for me, that is addressing that tension, which has always been there in our country, is one of the most necessary things. And the Black Lives Matter movement is just another civil rights movement and a long line of necessary ones to have those changes in our country.
And if I can just add really quickly, it's also about, remaining consistent. Like this summer, for example, the protests we had, thousands of people attending, but it's so easy to see how when you're not forced to see it happen or when it's not immediately affecting your life, you can easily fall silent in an issue that doesn't have an effect on you. So if you choose to get involved in Black Lives Matter, I encourage you to remain consistent in what you're helping and what you're pushing forwards, because if you were there in June and then a year when we approach this June in 2021 and you're back going about your normal life, I encourage you to reflect and see what's different in your life now and then reflect on what other people are experiencing now and then, and the people that are still doing this work and how their lives have changed compared to yours. I also think it's super important for allies to know their place in this movement, and to remember that it's not about, taking over a light, but about uplifting the voices that are in these spaces, and to not take over a space when you come into a space, but to really serve as an ally and as a voice in your own communities and not take over the voices of others. And then the last thing I wanted to say is when you go into a community and you advocate for people of color, remember the grassroots organizers that were there, especially if, there's any youth on this call that are going to schools in another state, or there's any, students that go to school in Chapel Hill. I encourage you to think about the community members and the people that were there before you and the people that will be there after you, because they have been doing this work for a long time. So instead of coming into a community and trying to up and do something that they've been doing for years, use that community as a resource to you and help them maybe do the things that they've been doing for a long time in that same community.
Okay, so great. I really appreciate all of y'all's thoughts. So our next question, it will be especially for Lieutenant Quick. So as a police officer, what do you feel is a proper way to limit or stop police brutality?
Ooh, that question has a lot of moving parts. As a profession, we have to be honest with ourselves in our training about how our history has shaped the perspective that many have of us now. We also have to be honest with ourselves by how some outcomes throughout this country shaped the perspective of law enforcement. Now, that being said, I firmly believe, and I can speak about my department exclusively because this is where I work, I firmly believe that our department supports Black Lives Matter in the context of our professional service to the public. We value life equally, and we desire the most appropriate outcome in every situation that we encounter. I can speak to any number of situations that maybe comparatively to other places where there might have been some similarities, the outcome was much more favorable for us than it would have been in that other situation. The tricky part is, I heard people mention about media and that sort of thing. We have become a society that would rather gravitate to the negative story than the positive story. And I understand that, because in my line of work, the positive outcome is the desired outcome. It's also the expected outcome. So as long as you're getting the expected results, there really isn't a lot of concern. It's when the unexpected or the undesired results draw a lot of attention. And unfortunately, in the nature of my work, when we get undesired results, it also triggers a certain emotional reaction. When we have emotional reactions to things, we have a tendency to overlook objectivity. And when you have other factors involved, we can take a very subjective approach. Now, that being said, looking at allegations or cases of brutality, it has to be looked at two ways. The first way is that individual situation and looking at it from start to finish. I'm a firm believer that the outcome just didn't happen out of thin air. You have to look at all the causality leading up to it. And you have to look at it objectively, both sides. In addition to that, we always need to be in the mindset of we can do it better. We always need to be in the mindset of looking at each situation and saying, did we do that as well as we could, rather than simply, did we do it according to the book? Did we do it so that it was justified? As I talk with officers on my shift, and I try to influence and encourage throughout the department, that needs to be our standard. Our standard needs to be, did we do it the best way we could? And if we didn't, how are we going to do it better if we're faced with that situation going forward? When you discover that, for lack of better terms, brutality is more than just an isolated incident in the department, but actually a culture, for lack of better terms. And of course, that matter is going to have to be looked at much more deeply from a perspective of internal leadership and maybe external investigators. But by and large, our protocols for hiring and background checking are tremendously better now than what they were. Well, I shouldn't say better. They are much more complex than they were, say, 15, 20, 25 years ago. Because the nature of our work now is not so much about reasonable suspicion, probable cause. The nature of our work is about evaluating totality of the circumstances and developing solutions for people in the midst of crisis. And as long as we continue to embrace that while still using our safety tactics and everything, from the perspective, again, from our department, I feel confident that our track record will continue to be a very exemplary and favorable track record with regards to our consistency in being fair and impartial in the treatment of our citizens. Now, that being said, our profession is very identifiable. Badge, gun, nameplate, duty gear, uniform. So even being a department that has not brought that sort of notoriety to this community, we realize we're going to bear some of the criticism that comes with others who wear the uniform. Oftentimes we talk on my shift about situations where there's allegations, suspicion of brutality, and we break it down in debrief. We're a bit at a disadvantage because we can't possibly know all the facts. But for every situation that you have or has been spoken during this time with regards to undesirable outcomes involving law enforcement, particularly with people of color, we have those conversations here, and we talk about ways to look at that for the information that's available to us and develop strategies on how not to have that. The community policing idea or concept plays a huge role in that. It is always better to know the people in advance of actually responding to them in crisis. If you've seen me here today, you have a certain familiarity with it. If you're in crisis and I recognize you and you recognize me, my belief and my hope is that that will provide a measure of calmness, knowing that I'm there to try to help you in the midst of that crisis. If I'm a complete stranger to you and you're a complete stranger to me, then we have to try to find a way to break that ice. And a crisis situation is not the best time to try to break that ice. But because of our efforts to be engaged with the community and hopefully the community wanting to be equally as engaged with us, we do our best to know someone when we respond to them so that there's some familiarity, so we don't have to go through that icebreaker. And that goes a long way to our ability to be able to de-escalate situations to keep from having them end up in an undesirable result. So again, we're committed to the citizens of this community and fair and impartial and professional service to our community. A paradigm shifting concept I like to call, instead of protect and serve, I like to say protection through service. We're going to help you through your crisis. We're going to be knowledgeable about advocacy resources available to you, and the hope that those advocacy resources can be available in real time so that we can do what's called a warm handoff and get you where you need to be, especially if jail is not the place where you need to be.
Thank you for your answer. So our next question is for Naya, Adam, and Ryan. Culturally, how do you think the movements in 2020 changed the discussion around inequality?
So I think what we saw firsthand in 2020 and spilling over into 2021. Sorry. So yeah, as I was saying, the events we saw in 2020 and leading into 2021, we've seen, clear depictions of inequality in the eyes of treatment under the law, as far as punishments for the officers who killed Breonna Taylor. And we've seen, firsthand and recently with the Capitol protests and riots, that there's undeniable unfair treatment between Black communities and white communities that are protesting and rioting. It's unacceptable, and I think what's apparent is that inequality, that systematic racism that's apparent. And now that it's clear, it's available to everyone, I think it's time that it should be acted on.
I think that the discussion kind of changed only in that the people that were in the discussion. I think the things that we've been talking about for the past few years, the content of that didn't change. I think Black Lives Matter has been talked about for years. People have been protesting for years. Disparities when it comes to Black life and healthcare was brought to light this year in relation to the pandemic, but that has been talked about for years as well. I think the only change was that more people were being brought to the table, more people were being introduced to the conversations that were happening previously, but I don't think any new ideas were brought to the table in this last 2020, only that the media started picking up more stories. People began to realize that it's not only about, the communities where the national media is talking about Like, for example, it's not just about what happens in Florida, or it's not just what happens in Chicago. It's not just what happens in New York, but these similar stories are happening in small towns like Chapel Hill and Carborough. It's not all about, these major cities that are getting all the media attention, but you really have to think about how that relates to the town that you live in and apply those same ideas and principles that are being talked about in your town and how you can be a part of those conversations.
I think the thing for me is that due to COVID-19, it made it clearly apparent of all the issues that were already there in our country and forced us to shine a spotlight on them, which then led to a lot more intersectional approaches to how we see justice in our country. I mean, because of COVID-19, it's forced us to reconsider not just how class, race, sex, gender can influence your idea in politics or even in just your day-to-day life, but how that relates to your literal chances of surviving an illness if you go to a hospital, or how that relates to your community being able to handle the possibility of that happening to you. I think those conversations also go into how we perceive each factor which goes into someone being treated unjustly by our society. Not just race, but class, mental illness, gender, and being able to recognize all of those factors and form a whole discussion about not just understanding the systemic issues in our country, which impact some people, but how they honestly impact some people worse than other ones, and honestly admitting that. And that is a matter of understanding your place and knowing and being able to admit that. I mean, I'll be honest, prior to 2018, if you would have told me, hey, Ryan, are you an inherently racist person? I would have said, no, of course not. Why do you think that? But accepting the fact that we've been raised in a society which provides Western beauty standards and ways of understanding who we are through a Western lens, that some preconceived notions we have of existence are racist, is something that I think 2020 has really brought out and put a spotlight on, because we have nothing else to look at now. COVID-19 has taken over our lives and have forced us to reassess the issues which it has impacted disproportionately for some groups and individuals. And I think that's really what's changed the discussion around inequality.
So thank you for all your inputs. So I have another question for everyone. So pertaining to the Capitol and its assault, how do you or how did you feel about it?
I'll go first on this one. So my initial reaction, and I told this to the Chapel Hill Carborough NAACP Youth Council, because we had a meeting the day after, I believe, or the day of. We had a meeting the day of when it happened. I honestly was just sitting there laughing at people who were just acting real stupid. Like, how do you, it just didn't make sense to me. It just threw me off. Like, how do you storm a Capitol building? Like, that just doesn't make sense. Like, that's one of the places where it's supposed to be locked down. I remember there was one woman who turned into the Capitol building a few years ago and did it accidentally, and she was killed. So like, that just didn't make sense to me. So it was a prime example of white privilege. It was if that was a Black Lives Matter protest, which it would never have been, because the Black Lives Matter movement just doesn't do that and would never think about doing that, there would be a whole lot of people dead right now. There would be a whole lot of Black bodies who are being buried and people who would be mourning right now because a whole lot of people would be dead. The police department and many, like the military and things like that, they would have known about it prior to. And the way that the Capitol building is being blocked down now, it would have been like that 2 days prior. So there's just a big prominent visual representation of like a double standard, and it just wasn't okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Kendall said. I just want to uplift her name, Miriam Carey. I don't know what year it happened, but she was having a mental health crisis and she was dealing with postpartum, a common issue in the Black community when it comes to Black maternity. And she drove into the Capitol and they killed her with her newborn child in the back seat. So to me, it was not even a matter of shock when I saw it, because I knew, similar to what Kendall said, it could have easily been a massacre if it were Black people that chose to take over the Capitol building. And we saw that with protests that happened this summer when people weren't even on federal property and they were being treated more harsh than the people that were on federal property a few weeks ago. I think it's also important to note that these are federal buildings that aren't just protected by one fence or one line of security. These are locked down federal buildings that no one, unless you are given the permission and authority to get in these buildings, you're not supposed to be able to gain entrance into those buildings. So to me, that lets me know that they were working inside and communicating with people within that building in order to gain entrance into that building. I think it's important for us to realize in this moment that it's not just racism that exists in these towns, not where we're from or, in rural areas, but they exist in Congress, in our school system, in healthcare, and so many other places that people like to neglect that they exist. So it's a lot more than how they were treated, but about how they were able to gain entry to that building. And I also think it's a matter of how they're being treated after. It was very easy this summer when people were protesting peacefully and being arrested for it. They weren't able to retreat to their homes that night. They were arrested the day of, or they were arrested during that protest. These people that led a violent insurrection were able to return to their homes or their hotels that night and sleep and converse and just regain their thoughts that night. And now the FBI is beginning to look for them or starting to contact people who might know them. But it's not a matter of searching when it came to Black Lives Matter. I believe it was, I can't remember the state, but a woman was found this summer from a Black Lives Matter protest from something that she purchased on Etsy. And that's how the government found her. So it should be no excuse why they can't find people that were taking federal property out of a building and that were sitting in places that they should have never been able to gain access to. So it's a matter of who's on the inside and who's communicating with us to the outside and what the media is deciding to portray. So I think that's one of the most important things to take note of in this particular situation.
Witnessing that event for me, it was just another event in a long history of white rage in this country. It's just that we aren't taught about many of them. For example, the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, where a mob of white supremacists violently overthrew African-American leaders. And instances of those things where white people just get enraged and cause violence is an integral part of understanding United States history. And it's something that has happened again and again and again. And this is just the pinnacle of an issue that has, once again, always been there within our country. And I think it also goes to speak to the privilege and hubris of the people doing this thing, that they weren't wearing masks at the event. I just want to emphasize how wild that is. You're not wearing a mask during the midst of COVID-19, and you're not wearing a mask in a federal building where there are cameras. You have a survival advantage of wearing a mask or not getting caught, and you're so hubristic and so believing in your mentality that you walked into a federal building without one. The amount of construction and the amount of sheltering that it takes to build an individual which is capable of doing something that just wild is years upon years upon years of education. And I think throwing out the fact that these people are not just violent white racists, to be frank, many of them, who wore things that shirts that said Camp Auschwitz, which as someone who has a grandma whose family fled from Germany during the Holocaust, just insults me beyond belief. These people are people within our society, people who have jobs, people who are leaders in their own community, people who have financial means to go all the way to Washington, D.C. in the midst of COVID-19 and storm the Capitol building. The power that those people hold, and at least to me, is the most terrifying part, because many of them, because of the fact of how horrendously Capitol Police were able to handle it due to lack of leadership within our government, means that many of them are just going to go on living their lives, putting in those beliefs that they think hold true in their policies, their work, their children. And recognizing that those people live a life separate from the act that they committed on that day is one of the things that I think people are leaving out and not talking about. And furthermore, in regards to the violence, I think you're just lying to yourself if you're saying this is an unexpected outcome. We're a nation that has fetishized violence as a political means. We're one that pats ourselves on the back because we were founded upon shedding the blood of one of the biggest empires. And then saying that the side of the political spectrum, which repeatedly says come and take it when responding to gun issues, or the side that says we need the Second Amendment to overthrow the government if they go tyrannical, or tried to overthrow the government when they went tyrannical, and acting like that is a surprise just seems like you're lying to yourself about something that, once again, has always been there. And not recognize the history and the education of these individuals, the polarization that has come from sites like Facebook, which repeatedly push people to the far right, and all the processes which have come together to make a mob of thousands of people who are willing to storm the Capitol building. And the fact that we've been able to normalize it, that statement doesn't put an inherent shock in my body, is insane. And I think recognizing it as such is the only logical way to actually deal with that and try to go beyond it, and not just understanding the event as an independent blip on the radar, but a long series of white rage within our country is important to making solutions that'll help us later on.
For me, when I look at what happened at the Capitol, the nature of law enforcement work should be rooted in intelligence and investigation. Here's what we knew. Congress was meeting at the Capitol for the purpose of finalizing and ratifying the electoral votes for the outcome of the most recent election. There had been a number of reported comments or encouragement from very influential people to have people or to direct people to converge on the Capitol building to interfere and even maybe persuade, or if you want to use, threaten Congress to not ratify the results of the election. So being empowered with all of that intel and information, I am baffled by what appears to be the lack of preparation to lock down a building that is already supposed to be considered secure. Now, again, I'm going to be careful with my responses here because I don't know all the facts that went on. So I'm going strictly off the limited information that I've seen on outlets, as well as what I can glean through intel resources that trickle down to my level. From an opinion standpoint, I do feel like that were it a different group descending upon the Capitol building and law enforcement resources had access to the same intelligence and investigation, the outcome would have been very, very different. The preparation would have been very, very different. And that concerns me beyond words why it was not. The lesson that I take from that is, in the small community where I work here in Carrboro, that we see areas elsewhere where things could have been done better. And in the event that we see situations and circumstances that could have such a huge impact on our community, that we do our very best job to make positive use of that information, to try to have dialogue with the parties involved, if it is an inevitability, to try to make sure that it remains peaceful, to try to have staffing in place in a manner not antagonistic, but at the ready to protect the safety and interests of the public at large here in Carrboro. I realize I'm speaking in specifics, but I have to because this is a community that I'm responsible for as a team for the police department. So that's where the relevance comes in with this situation for me. As an individual person, I hate that I can't say that I'm surprised. And because I'm not surprised, I am hurt. But I'm hoping that we're at a turning point, that we're working to turn the corner now with some of the changes that are on the horizon and the discussions that are now being had in the open like we're having today, that not very long ago were the type of discussions that people said, well, you don't talk about those things. You don't talk about politics. You don't talk about race. You don't talk about sensitive topics. That's how we have stayed ignorant for so long, and things have reached this level of division. So now that the pendulum has tipped all the way one side, we don't need to bring it back to the other side. We need to find common ground in the middle.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Definitely, agree with everything Nye and Kendall said. I think I've heard a lot since the insurrection. A lot of people say, this isn't us, this isn't America, but it is us. That is the reality. There are two Americas, and that was one of them. And I definitely agree. If those people that stormed the Capitol look different, there'd be a lot of dead bodies. I'm sure Nye can attest to this, but I lived in DC for a summer and would go running a lot in the evenings. And I remember one time, just a random Tuesday night, 10 p.m., going on a run, ran to the Capitol and, stopped for a drink of water. And within the 2 to 3 minutes that I was drinking water, there was 3 armed officers walking towards me. I mean, the security on that place is just, and this is, 10 p.m. on a random day. I don't even think Congress was in session. No one's even in the building, and it's being guarded to that level. And you're telling me that, like Lieutenant Quick was saying, on a day when Congress is meeting on a topic that is known to be controversial, that the security just lets these people storm the building? There's just so many aspects to that there's just no way. Like, you can't logically tell me that. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think what I really hope from this, tragedy at the Capitol is unacceptable behavior, is unity, and is people understanding, firsthand and seeing, like, this is not okay. This is what happens when things get out of control. Yeah, just the thought, like, if you would have said anything along the lines of the Capitol would be breached and a session of Congress would be halted and an election would be questioned, you said that 10 years ago, I just wouldn't believe you. But what's sad is that that's believable in 2020 and 2021. And I just hope, as Lieutenant Quick said, that the pendulum starts to swing the other way. And this is the point where we start asking those hard questions and just realize, like, how unacceptable everything that has been going on really is.
If I can just add really quickly too, I think it's all about, making the situation what happened a reality. I think people like to water it down and make it seem like it wasn't what it was, but this was an act of terrorism, and people aren't realizing, like Ty was saying, the amount of security and how it was federal property, and everyone is calling it anything but what it is. And that's a matter of the problem too, when it comes to the vocabulary and the language that we use, and when it comes to the people that were involved. Had this been another race, there would be no hesitation to call it an act of terrorism. But now, because there's a different side or a different group of people participating, people are hesitant to call it what it is. And I think if we are trying to move forward and live the dream or whatever we've been talking about and be transparent, we have to call this act of terrorism an act of terrorism, despite who was involved. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, so thank you all for your points and observations. You have all left us with a lot to consider and to think about. So our last and final question before we hear from the audience is for everyone. So if we could take one idea out of the events of 2020, which one seems most important in regards to MLK and the continuing movement?
if no one else would like to position, like when I approach a community as an alien member, it's best for me to just say, hey, what do you need me to do? And a community leader within that community tell me, hey, this is what we this, that, and that done, rather than me projecting what I may think are things that should happen. And doing that on every single level where you're willing to not just wanting or having this desire to be a leader, which I think is an issue in our country where we fetishize the idea of everyone being a leader, quotation marks, but being able to do humble work to try to make a movement go forward is the most important thing I think I have gotten out of, well, at least how I understand in relation to MLK's or Dr. King's legacy, because nothing's going to happen unless you actually act on all of these things and go to protest and go and act in a way that is most appropriate with your place in those movements too. And understanding that and acting upon it accordingly is what is most important in regards to Dr. King's legacy to me.
I would like to agree with what you just said, Ryan. The fact that what I've learned from this movement and what 2020 was and what 2021 has been so far, change doesn't happen without action. Like, you can't sit at home and post things on social media and post black screens on your Instagram saying Blackout Tuesday, Black Lives Matter, and all that stuff. You can't say that and then not go to protests or donate to organizations like the Black Lives Matter movement and things in that nature. You have to be able to go out and make your opinion known to people other than your people who look at your Instagram stories or people who like your Instagram feed or whatever. Like, you have to be able to go out and talk to people and have these conversations that we're having now. And if you don't do that, we won't get the change that we want out of this country, and we won't get to the dream that Dr. King professed to us almost 58 years ago. So what I learned is that change doesn't happen without action, and you can't sit and say, oh, I want change, and don't go out and make that change happen.
I think for me, similar to what's been said already, but consistency is key. I think all summer we heard people say, this is a movement, not a moment, but you really have to stand behind those words. It's so easy if something is not affecting you to fall silent about it. And I encourage everybody to not do that, because that's simply how it can become just a moment. But really pushing yourself, even when you feel like you're not being affected by something, think about the people that can easily be affected by this if you choose to stay silent about it. And it was Dr. King that said it himself, like, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. So the moment that we choose to stop voicing our opinion about the things that matter to us, about the things that matter to the people we love, that's the day that all the work that we've done, it starts to end. So we don't want to put all this work to waste. We don't want all the work that other people have been doing for years to go to waste. So it's up to us to continue to use our voice and our platforms and our communities to continue to push for all the things that we want to see and we want to come to light. So I just encourage everybody to keep using their platform and keep using their voice. Even if you think that something doesn't affect you, 9 times out of 10, it's going to affect someone else.
I stepped away for a moment and realized that there was a question that was asked while I was gone. The one idea from the events of 2020, the only word that really comes to mind, like I said, is empathy. And the reason why that continues to come to mind for me is because once you've made up your mind about an issue, a topic, subject, whatever the case may be, the only way that your mind changes is either because you have become negatively impacted as a result of what your stance was, and then you begin to understand what other people have experienced. Well, that's called sympathy. If you have to wait for that to happen, then it's too late. So I have to remind myself oftentimes with my job, in my personal life, being empathetic to what someone else is going through and understanding that just because it's not my experience doesn't mean that it's not valid. the desire to have the conversation to better understand where they're coming from. And if I'm having that conversation with that person, it's not coincidence. It's not happenstance. There was a reason, there was a purpose. And because there's a reason or a purpose, then that means I have some responsibility to be able to offer something to the betterment of that situation. That's never more apparent than being in law enforcement, because the majority of times that we're called, people are in varying degrees of crisis. Now, there are situations that we go to that when you hear the facts about them, it makes you wonder, how did someone prioritize this as crisis? But you have to reel yourself in and remind yourself, this isn't your crisis, this is their crisis. So you need to try to offer up solutions, and you may even be able to come to a point to be able to show them a path to be able to solving and resolving their own issues. If we can successfully do that in our profession, then we are effectively removing ourselves from situations that don't need law enforcement presence, so people can move to solution within their own understanding and work together with one another. Because a great deal of the situations that we're brought into now have very little to do with criminal behavior, and more so to do with disagreements, misunderstandings, perceptions. And it's so interesting in this day and time with so much information is at our fingertips, rather than looking for alternatives, rather than working on de-escalation, rather than checking ourselves for implicit bias, we call 911 and expecting the outcome, the police to deliver the outcome based upon our stance. That has created far more situations and far more opportunities for the outcome to be, as I mentioned earlier, undesirable. So as change agents, as we demonstrate de-escalation, as we demonstrate conflict resolution and problem solving, the hope is that we're able to facilitate that same mentality with the public at large. And then we wind up really community policing, helping one another in that context.
You know, what comes to my mind with 2020 is awareness. And I think that's a big message that we need to bring on into the future. Being aware of what's going on in our country is vital. And being aware of, you know, the implicit biases that exist in our country is important as it always has been. And, you know, Ryan had mentioned earlier in the presentation about how COVID-19 has really made everyone aware of, you know, where these weak points are in our society and how we can improve. And I think that as we become more aware of the faults in our society and accepting those faults as real, that's a large step that I think a lot of people struggle with, is accepting that the way things are isn't the way things have to be. And I think that that's an important message that we can carry on into the following years as Black Lives Matter continues and into future movements.
I just want to add real quickly, and echoing what Naya said around, you know, the idea of a movement, not a moment, and what Naya said earlier about really bringing the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that to our local community. So just really encouraging all of those youth that came out this past summer to continue getting involved locally in whatever way they can. And, you know, one pretty simple way is we have an off-year municipal election coming up in 2021 in the fall. And I know our turnout rates are usually, horrendous in these off-year local elections. So that's, one way, just getting informed and coming out and participating and making your voice heard.
And I think Ty is the perfect example of like the age is, I think before I didn't have an idea of like, you have to be a certain age, maybe 30, 40 plus to run in these elections, but it's really endless. And Ty is our perfect example of you can be young and you can also hold office. So beyond even voting in these elections, you can hold office as well. And that goes for anybody on the call as well. That these elections, we need people that represent our communities. I see Paris in the chat. We need people that represent our communities to serve in these roles, and these legislative roles, and these boards that are opening up, so that we as a community can go out and back and support them when it comes down to our lives.
If I may, even beyond the elected positions and the boards, we need people of this diverse mindset to also join our ranks in law enforcement. There was a time that the demographic was overwhelmingly one-sided in this profession, and the vacancies were limited. We had a number of people that we could select from, and the expectation and qualifications were very, very different than what they are now. Because the expectation and qualifications have changed, and rightfully so, maybe some of the people from the traditional demographic find that they are less inclined or less capable to adjust to what the paradigm is for our profession. That creates openings and opportunities. Like the saying goes, if you want to see a change, then be the change. And there's no greater service than at the grassroots level when you're dealing with the public on a day in, day out basis and helping to shape their lives for the better. And we need more and more people who have some lived experience, who have some diverse mindset, and have the ability to come in and not only be able to do traditional law enforcement functions, but to do the job with a more progressive mindset in a means of do no harm and deflect from criminality, to be able to help them move beyond their crisis and hopefully keep them from slipping back down into that space again.
So thank you for all of your input. We have 2 questions or 3. I'm gonna try to answer them. So one of the questions are regarding North Carolina's history, including the Wilmington insurrection. What did you learn or not learn from classes at school versus from your community?
I mean, I can start. I went to school in Indian Trail, North Carolina, which is a little more rural and a little different looking than the diverse community of Chapel Hill and Carborough. But I would confidently say I didn't learn any of that in school. I mean, a lot of the history, especially around the civil rights movement and all of that stuff, I did not learn or was not exposed to until I came to UNC and went, out of my way to take courses and, read books and stuff like that. But yeah, throughout high school, none of that was ever a part of the curriculum.
Building off. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I cut you off? Okay. Building off what Ty said, I actually live right near Indian Trail as well. I went to Sun Valley High School prior to attending NCSSM. So I've had the unique privilege to go to this progressive school, NCSSM, and the differences in curriculum as far as social justice and understanding the civil rights movement. It's incredibly apparent. Across my 9th and 10th grade years, I can only count a handful of instances where I learned hardly anything about social justice movements going on, and in particular with Black Lives Matter. I had no idea what the movement was or what it was about until going to NCSSM. And I'm very grateful for that privilege to be able to go to a school like that, and that ideas of social justice and change are very open at the school that I go to. But I can definitely echo what Ty was saying.
I went kindergarten through 12th grade in Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools. So I learned probably, I would feel 95% sure saying that I learned very little about North Carolina history. And I can 100% tell you that I learned nothing about Chapel Hill history. I think that our district is trying to change that a little bit now. I have a niece that goes to Northside, and she can tell me more about Chapel Hill history than I can, which is a little bit embarrassing, but it also makes me feel better knowing that we have a school here that is doing the right thing and teaching our youth about the history and the community around them. But I also have peers that are going to schools in this district, and they're not getting that same knowledge. A lot of the knowledge that I got about my community in Chapel Hill came from my family and other community members through like the NAACP and other programs that I was in Chapel Hill. But I can confidently say very little of it came from the actual education system, which is something that really needs to change. But beyond just North Carolina history, the curriculum is super biased, and it teaches a very whitewashed history of what our American history looked like. And we talked about that a little bit earlier in the conversation, but it's whitewashed, and it teaches us very little about the history of our own community that we live in, which is also super important, uplifting the voices. We learn about things like the Greensboro 4, but we have our very own Chapel Hill 9 that we don't learn about in school. So things like that are super important, and I think they should definitely be uplifted, especially here in Chapel Hill in our school system.
I was going to say, the thing that matters to me a lot as it pertains to education is our notion of education in the United States is polluted by a capitalist vision of getting a job eventually. In many cases, when you do try to implement these changes to curriculum or have a better concept of what our country means, you're met with defiance because it's, people don't want to do this because it's not going to help them get a job later on, or it won't be good for them as a participant in society to know these things. But we need to severely alter our view of how an education should serve an American and how it should serve understanding our country. Because you hear these things from, to be frank, people who are conservative about how colleges and universities are indoctrinating our youth to be liberals, when the fact of the matter is they're just teaching history as it has been for the past 100 years in the United States. And if the natural reaction to that is becoming politically more left, then we need to investigate why history isn't taught as such within our schools at the most basic level. I think that is very much a matter within our country of different political groups wanting to defund education and wanting it to have education shine light on a personal narrative within the United States, one that preaches our American exceptionalism rather than realizing the faults within our country. And just reassessing how we even understand an education is the most important thing to me. And as it pertains to me understanding Black Lives Matter movement and pretty much any issue of justice within our country, I felt like I learned nothing at my home high school because, for one, I'd have discussions with teachers who, to be honest, in many cases didn't agree with those movements. And then when I did have teachers who did agree with those movements, my classmates have been raised in a community where they have been taught that those movements are inherently hostile to them in some way, shape, or form, which then means you can't even have an active discussion within that class. So I think starting that, not just seeing education as something that you have to do later on so you can be a better individual, but something that we should change so people don't have to alter their path in life to be a better participant in society. As long as you have to teach yourself something about the history of the United States outside of our schooling system that makes you understand the issues in our country more, then that's a sign that our education system just isn't doing enough, and we need to alter it. I think that's the most essential key to making this work.
Before I came to Middle College High School at Durham Tech this semester and this last semester, I was at East Chapel Hill High School in Chapel Hill, and I was lucky enough to be a part of the Social Justice Academy, where I had two teachers because I was there my freshman and sophomore year. I had Mrs. Stapleton and I had Mr. Link, and I feel like I was able to have very social justice related conversations with them, and especially because of the fact that I was one of a very small amount of kids of color in those classes, which is still very crazy to me, but that's just a completely different story. And even with the Social Justice Academy, I don't feel like I've learned much about, and even with going to Durham Tech now and doing that dual enrollment, high school classes and college classes, I don't feel like I've learned much about my community through my schools. I feel like I've learned it outside in other organizations. Like I'm lucky enough to be a member of this organization called Living Legends. And through that organization, I have been able to learn from adults and the living legends of my community and about the world that I live in now and the world I reside in. And that's just, like I said, it's not from my school. So I feel like the school system throughout just needs to work on that and needs to work on being able to have those uncomfortable conversations, because the whole reason that people haven't been having these conversations because they feel as if they will make the students uncomfortable. They feel like it'll make them uncomfortable. And we just need to get past that. It's going to be uncomfortable no matter what. So we just need to have those conversations so then we can teach people and help build solutions so we won't have to go through those cycles all over again.
If no one else has anything to say, something I want to make in addition is we also have this notion in this country of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and doing the work necessary to be successful. And we inherently teach discomfort in that way, yet we show our hypocrisy by the fact that we're not okay with showing discomfort when having issues that pertain to how there's things in our countries that are wrong. I think we need to be able to embrace discomfort both as a means to better ourselves, but also to better our society.
So if no one has any other comments, I am going to go to the audience. So there's another question, and they said, as a youth or as a person living in Carrboro, how do you view the recent efforts of the town of Carrboro approving Black Lives Matter morals? What effect or message would you like to impact the community as a whole?
If you don't mind, I'd like to address this first, primarily because my phone is about to go out, so this might be the last little bit. As I mentioned earlier about the movement and the validity of the movement, the announcement in the form of murals and those words being printed everywhere serves as a wonderful reminder. But as someone mentioned earlier, it means nothing if we don't put the work in behind it. Again, I'm representing law enforcement, specifically the Carrboro Police Department, and the team of officers here is committed to supporting fair and impartial treatment in our professional administrative services to the entire community of the town of Carrboro. So Black Lives Matter has always mattered to us, will always matter to us, and we will conduct ourselves accordingly. I'm gonna have to go now. I think my phone's about to cut out. Thank you everyone for the invite and for the very enlightening discussion. You all are wonderful leaders of the future, and who knows, maybe we'll get the opportunity to work together on some very important project right here in our community. Nice meeting you all. You can all reach me here at Carrboro Police Department. If you don't remember anything else, just remember Quick. They'll know who it is. Thank you.
Bye, Lieutenant Quick. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Tell
you.
Officer Dixon I said hi.
I most certainly will.
He's the homie.
I think that I'm definitely glad that the town of Carborough moved forward on the decision to paint the murals and display the words throughout the town. I think this summer I became more accustomed to what performative activism looked like, and I hope that's not what the town of Carborough is intending to do with this, because I think we've been repeating it this whole time, but while those are good things to display in the community, it's super important to back those words and back those words with actions from the community and from the people that hold positions of power in those communities, so that it's not just an act of performative activism, but the representation and the legislation that we see in those communities reflect those words that are displayed.
I had just reposted something earlier this morning, because I had just found out that they had just finished making that mural, the newest one. And I was just saying how much I love my town and I love that I live here because I feel like they accept me for who I am as a Black person in this community. But like Naya said, I really hope this is not a form of performative activism. I really hope that they're going to back their words with saying Black Lives Matter and having it all over the place. And I really hope that this is not just another Blackout Tuesday moment where people just post it and say Black Lives Matter and then just go back with their daily feed or their normal stories and whatever. I just hope that they can back their words and just help push this movement forward and not just have it displayed all over the town and make it look as though they do support. I want to see that. I want to see the action. So yeah.
I mentioned this earlier, but I was born and raised in Gibsonville. Then with Adam, I was also into NCSSM and had the opportunity to live in the Durham area for the past 1.5 years now. And the thing that coming from a community where I know it would never be approved for a Black Lives Matter mural to be put up in the first place, much less discussed even at a town hall meeting, is that it shows that there is an ability to have that conversation, which I think is incredibly important. Getting to the point where you're not just able to understand the movement, but able to discuss it in such a way that people don't get emotionally volatile and be able to approve something like that. To me, as someone living in a community where doing such is difficult, is astonishing and something that should be celebrated for what it is. Mind you, I 100% second the motion. You need to make sure it's not just some effort of symbolic change that doesn't have any systemic outcomes from it, but also recognizing the steps that led to that discussion being able to even happen is something I think is beautiful.
So if that is it and no one has any other questions, oh wait, never mind. We have one last question. So what policies and or issues would you most like to see local government take up?
For me, I'd say understanding what issues lead, as a general statement, having a better understanding of each member of the community, not just as individuals or as they pertain to certain groups. And I say that because throughout, at least in my view of government, there's an inherent disconnect by some of the people who participate within government and the people who are most affected by those decisions and outcomes. And I think the best way to combat that or deal with that issue is by trying to make sure that at your local level, you'll participate actively in those elections. I voted myself for the first time this year, which felt pretty great. And understanding how that landscape can be changed by you doing so. As for the specific issues, for me, at your local level, police brutality, incredibly important. Having that discussion within your local department or group can really make a good change, especially talking to individuals about what their place in this system is. And secondly, I'd say general economic relief / community ties and helping. If you're capable at an individual level to have organization like that, do so and help those as you can. But having a community that recognizes that as a necessary part of helping each other and uplifting everybody, no matter what economic condition or place they're in their life at that moment, is essential to not making a community where one select group can thrive, but everyone can thrive.
I would say for me, one of the super important things on the local level would be admitting, educating, and discovering the authentic history of the town that you live in, from the root of the name to the people that inhabited those spaces before you, and just the history of that community. I think that's super important for any political leader or figure that holds a position in that town. You should know the history in the town that you're representing. I think another important thing is acknowledging the biases in your community and the community that you're representing, knowing the different types of people that you represent and the diversity that you are supposed to be accountable for, reflecting that through the policies that you bring to the table. I think another super important issue is gentrification in our communities and the people that we are pushing out and the people that have historically inhabited those spaces, and now the people that are coming into those spaces, especially living so close to a college. It's so easy for that to happen, and we're seeing it happen right now. Police funding compared to mental health and housing and education in our communities. And then lastly, just how we uplift youth voices and actually having centers for youth to express how they feel, but also who we're recruiting into those spaces in our community and who we're making those spaces available for, including resources, but also a physical space so that conversations like this can happen more often, in a space where you feel comfortable, in a space where youth can come and be amongst people who might not look like them or might not have the same ideas as them, but they can come to a collective agreement on how to move forward.
So does anyone have any other comments?
I'll add on to what Naya said. I want to go specifically into education. I have a friend named Joya who has spoken a lot about the fact that we need to work on how there is a lack of representation of people of color in our textbooks. Our textbooks are so outdated and just there's so much that needs to be done with those. So the primary thing is that the youth will carry the future. Not like it's we have like it's I'm trying to like format my words. We will be running this country very soon. So being able to educate our younger people and our people who are our age and just people in college and things like that about our community and the every form of history that we have, not just white history. We have to make sure everyone knows about those so then we can make sure that all the tragedies and all the bad things that have happened in this country don't happen again. So just building on the fact that we need to work on what we are teaching our students because it is very whitewashed and there is not many, there are a lot of students who feel as though they are not being represented in their textbooks and that's just not okay. So just building on that and just teaching the youth so then they can help run this country because they will be running it soon.
So if that is it, I want to again thank you to our guest panelists and the people that are joining right now. And I would like to acknowledge the work of our youth councils, the Carrboro Youth Advisory Board, the Carrboro Youth Council, and the Chapel Hill Carrboro NAACP Youth Councils. We hope you leave with a renewed commitment to doing the continued work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for joining us today and to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And goodbye until next year.
Thank you, guys. It's been fun.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank y'all so much for being here.
Everyone in the audience who is here listening as I had this discussion and listening to all these powerful voices.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Remember, Monday is a day on, not a day off, and enjoy your long weekend.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. This was a wonderful event. Special thanks to all of our youth. the mentors for all of those groups. Thanks for getting this together. Look forward to doing it in person next year, hopefully. But thanks so much, Miles. You did an excellent job moderating. And to our panelists, the time that y'all have put into this and your contributions and thoughtful responses are so appreciated. Thank you. And thank you for the leadership that y'all are continuing to do, in your roles moving on. Thank you.